Alrighty, cool, welcome. I'm always stoked to have Aki here for lecture, but this one I'm like super excited about. And I know I probably say that like every time now, but because I'm super excited about everyone I kind of get to bring into the program. But today we have Tiago Torres-Campos. He's a Portuguese landscape architect and full professor of landscape architecture at Rhode Island School of Design, which if you haven't seen the work from there, you absolutely must. It is amazing. Tiago, he practiced in Europe. He used to teach at the University of Edinburgh, one of the best landscape schools in the world, and where he got his PhD, a creative practice PhD as well from Edinburgh. Strong interest in representation, history and theory, funnily enough, the underground, hence why I'm very, very excited to have him join us. And I'm going to hand it over to you, Tiago, and go from there.
Great. Thank you so much for your kind introduction. Can I share my screen?
Yep, give it a go now.
Okay. Let me see. Can you see it?
Good as gold.
Okay. Is it moving the slides, Sean?
Yep.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. In Virginia and online. I have former student of mine and colleague of mine, Jen Ensley. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, the department, for inviting me to briefly talk a little bit about my work. I'm very happy to be here today, if only remotely at this time, but maybe another time I can actually visit you and meet you in person. Sean already introduced me, but for the sake of the presentation, I'm gonna just very quickly talk about a few things about me. So I'm a Portuguese landscape architect. I was born, brought up, and trained as such in Lisbon, where I work for a few years in practice. And these are some of the landscapes that I grew up in. And this was all before I then moved to Scotland, where I taught. As Sean said, I taught for about 8 years or so at the College of Art in Edinburgh. These experiences, coupled with my more recent work in different parts of North and South America and elsewhere in Europe as well, have given me a ground, even if indeterminate and often reactive, but nevertheless a ground from which to operate. And because of how I tend to operate, I think that the best way to explain how I develop my work is to describe it in terms of a triangulation where research, practice, and teaching constantly inform one another. My work involves constant theoretical and practical experimentation through design commissions and competitions, but also the curation of public exhibitions, and perhaps more importantly at this stage in my life, both academic and creative writing that sometimes may result in publications. I will briefly mention two publications that I think might be of interest in this presentation. My focus lies on an active questioning of conventional landscape architectural discourses and architectural discourses as well, and how they may expand our ways of being, our ways of knowing, but also inevitably in my case as an instructor, our ways of learning that may encourage students to develop a deep connection between mind, eye, and hand. In fact, that is a big thing for us here at RISD. Once again, we are talking about a type of triangulation, a type of embodied and bodily triangulation, if you may, that is interesting and appeals to me. Now, as the title of my presentation suggests, I am foregrounding, pun intended here, the well-established, even if sometimes forgotten idea of ground. And I'm doing so both literally, as in the structure and processes of the earth, and metaphorically, as in patterns of physical, intellectual, poetic, political structure that intersect, overlap, and weave together to become the context for human thought and action. As some of you might know, these words are not mine. They are quoted from an essay entitled Groundwork, written a few years ago by Robin Drips from UVA. Starting with this quote by J.B. Jackson, if background seems inappropriately modest, we should remember that in our modern use of the word, It means that which underscores not only our identity and presence, but also our history. So using this quote, Drips goes on to lament our common disregard for things operating in the background that lead to misconceptions of what is ground or where it can be found, to then finally conclude that ground is where human artifice and natural processes commingle for the benefit of both. So Drips defends ground can augment what architecture is capable of and ultimately help us work the complex entanglements in which humans forcefully coexist. Another thing that is important here in my introduction is Bruno Latour's, so the sociologist, Bruno Latour's reflection when he worried that critique might be running out of steam. And he referred to how inherent uncertainties, scientific or otherwise, with which we construct facts, are being efficiently used to undermine the values in our ways of being and knowing. And that is particularly relevant for the moment that we're going through in the world today. The necessary unsure ground on which realities are contested and constructed is muddying our realities, not advancing them. The only way forward, then, he claimed, is to actively reimagine our existence, what some may call our life worlds, through matters of concern. The current planetary sense of groundlessness, where socio-environmental struggles are real, as well as inequality, racism, classism, impacts us all, but as you know, impacts us very differently. These are causes for concern, and these concerns matter. If we are to stay with the trouble, Donna Haraway teaches us, then we must think with these concerns through an ethics of care. And this short context, which I will elaborate a little bit more on, is one of our points of departure for the conversation today. What do we care about and why? Ground is key to architecture and to how architecture may expand. Ground is a condition of, as much as a metaphor for practice. And it can also be a critical tool to question it, of course. It may also be important then to declare at this point that my presentation, what I'm talking about today, but indeed all of my work departs from one assumption, that ground matters in landscape architecture. In fact, one way of explaining what the discipline and associated profession do, which is a daunting task, and I'm not going to cover that today, but one way of explaining it is as a design practice of ground. My first question here is how to transform this type of thinking, essentially a thinking through ground, into both a praxis and a pedagogy where ethical and aesthetic concerns commingle for the generation of material conditions that are structured in space and time, and that some might accept as a viable definition of landscape. The subsequent question then is why such an approach should matter to us. Rather than offering definitive answers, which is not what I'm focused on here today, I'll instead use some of my recent work and teaching activities as, examples of how this may, as I said before, be foregrounded. To think about ground, one is required in a way to think about everything. And that is also another type of daunting task. Ground is thick, porous, and permeable. It is rhizomatic, boundless, and profoundly interconnected. It is not possible, or at least very limiting in my opinion, to think about ground without thinking about it as particles, systems, or scale, or about water, rock, and atmosphere, not to mention communities, territories, borders. Recently, I've argued in some of my writing that one possible way to think about this complexity is by a way of thinking through ground, that is, to cut across ground to make sense of it, or try to make sense of it. What I'm arguing for here comes close to an idea of section as we conceive it in architecture and landscape, a tool that is commonly used by all spatial disciplines, I would say, because it provides useful information in the way space and time are organized, let's say, vertically or radially to the Earth. In my work and teaching, I've come to understand that it is useful to sometimes think of this section visually, especially since it can generate an understanding that designers and thinkers can't usually access through mere observation. But this conceptual section can also be powerful when it becomes a metaphor to access ground intellectually, in which case it comes closer to thought experiments that oscillate between thinking about how ground spreads around the earth and how it thickens stratigraphically. A substantial part of this train of thought has been discussed with some of my students in a graduate seminar on ground that I currently teach here at RISD, where I'm based now. One of the first things that we discuss in that forum is how do we occupy ground? In this sense, ground is taken geologically. That is an entanglement of matter that is both mineral and synthetic. It is taken ecologically, that is a support to deep entanglements of rock, atmosphere, and biosphere. It is taken archaeologically, that is a forensic collection of traces and signals that erase violence and rework new strata. It is taken politically and socially as overlapping tension, disturbance, but also repair and regeneration. And in my case, it necessarily is also taken creatively, a grounding, this action verb that we use to explain constant becomings. I find it easier to think about or conduct these thought experiments in section with the help of prepositions of place such as on or under or above. So, for example, examining what happens on the ground implies thinking about it as an expendable surface. Probing underground invites us to deal with the thickness of its layers as some form of context. Hovering above ground encourages us to think about ground also as something essentially non-neutral, something that always already carries logics with desire and motivation. Of course, neat as these stratigraphic delineations might appear to us, the reality is actually muddier. Foreground also forces us to constantly bridge and negotiate between them. So, for example, what is on the ground can sometimes only be grasped if one also investigates what happens underground. Or in other words, to understand ground as surface, one also needs to understand it as thickness and vice versa. Or another example is that to examine ground with a set of scales that offer us perspectives from above, like satellite or a bird view, one also needs to zoom in to examine it from within, that is, as particles. So I began testing some of these ideas or some of these preoccupations with ground and how they might be incorporated in the pedagogical and experimental study of landscape with my PhD while I was still in Edinburgh, which Sean referred to briefly. It was a PhD by creative practice or by design, as we call it there. And the thesis explored how congested urban conditions like Manhattan, you're seeing, footage of that, how urban conditions like Manhattan, often read as the product and consequence of new liberal forms of capitalism, are also constant negotiations with the much thicker deep sections in which they forcefully exist, including all the stratigraphic delineations of atmosphere above and around it and geology beneath it. This was mostly a dissertation or a thesis about steering representation of the urban condition away from what we already know or what we think we already know about cities like New York, and instead probe us into readings of the city in profound articulation with its reactive ground, or what I conceive as it being a reactive ground. So the work sought to articulate an idea of architectural practice that is always already a practice of ground. In this context, ground is not simply context, but becomes also the contextual generator from which cities emerge as human constructs, that can only exist in profound entanglement with the earth and its geologics. Now, these geologics that I refer to are essentially logics that explain how ground exists, how soil is created and eroded, or how water moves, how light and shade hit the earth and reflect back, and so on. So logics essentially that explain how the city exists other than capitalism. I finished my PhD with this piece that you're seeing now, was kind of like my last exhibition. I finished it a few years ago after many years of work. And ever since then, I have been working on synthesizing it into a book, which I found it to be a very difficult task. But I can finally say that this book is coming out very soon. So, you know, hooray. It will be published by Oro Editions. I don't know if you know the publisher, at the end of this year or very early next year, the latest. So, you know, stay tuned if you're interested in this type of work. Speaking of books, I co-edited another book. This is another book a few years ago called Postcards from the Anthropocene, together with my colleague and friend Benek Chinchik. And the book tried to link creativity with an attentive questioning of what it may mean to practice, as in practice, but also co-practice, co-production, co-creation, contemplation, reflection, and so on. The book brings together communities of practitioners, so it's a collection of work, practitioners, academics, and artistic practices around how discursive and material conditions might transform how we think about representation. While the pieces showcased in the publication definitely diverge in terms of their approach and their content, they actually converge in a type of thinking that engages with contemporary existential preoccupations related to a certain sense of groundlessness. Not because ground is all of a sudden absent, on the contrary, but because it influences a generalized sense of anxiety caused by the progressive awakening to the so-called planetary urgencies. This book was published by DPR Barcelona, which is an independent publisher in Barcelona, precisely, in 2022, in case you're interested. Let me now talk about, or more specifically, about how ground influences my teaching. I've already mentioned a theory seminar that I currently teach where I discuss some of these topics and issues. I teach a lot more things than just that. I teach different studios to graduate students in their first, second, and third years. I teach also in architecture. I teach in interior architecture sometimes as well. And to tell you the truth, when I look back and forward, I can see that ground is an important thread in everything I taught and probably will ever teach. It is not unusual for design studios in landscape architecture programs to tackle ground as systems or particles, usually actually bridging between the two. Those of you who are studying landscape architecture now in this lecture, I think, have probably encountered one or another or both versions of this. So I will briefly mention 3 studio experiences, or 3 different studios, let's say, to demonstrate how students may encounter ground here at RISD or elsewhere that I've taught, and fold it as some sort of ethos in their design experimentations. The first one is the first core landscape studio here at RISD. And it introduces graduate students to the coastal landscapes of Rhode Island, the state of Rhode Island. Over the last decade, design principles has been formulated and taught by several RISD faculty in our department, most notoriously Suzanne Matthew, who led the most current revision, let's say, but also other people like Colgate Searle, who is in the pictures on the right, and some of you might know, Elizabeth Dean Herman, Joanna Barthmeyer Payne, and also me. I've taught a few years and I'm currently teaching this again. So departing from a more theoretical study of how ground works as a system, the students are encouraged to engage with a real site, which is a RISD property called Tillinghast Farm in Barrington. It's that red line on that map on the top left. It's a gentle south-facing slope forged by glacial retreat. All of the landscapes around here in New England have been forged by glaciers. That opens up to the much wider Narragansett Bay through a tidal salt marsh. To explore this ground's properties, we physically cut into it to reveal its soil horizon. So these images on the right. And the students then draw several sections based on observation and abstraction at specific scales, traveling all the way up to the 1-to-1 full scale. The students then confront the sectional knowledge they have with wide transects extending across the site from land to water. In this studio, we get to spend some really wonderful moments in late summer and fall at the farm, where the students in the farm, which also has a beach, where the students engage more directly with this ground and build site installations with us, like these, which these were specifically done just this past month, and it's really wonderful work. Transferring then what they observe to abstracted representations in the studio requires careful thinking about how that ground is composed and how to represent compressed organic, mineral, and synthetic matter. Difficult as it is initially, I'm not going to lie, especially for students without a design background, the exercise impacts their practice, both in terms of the technical knowledge it requires and the aesthetic it emanates, which is really important for us. Cut and exposed before their eyes, quite literally because we cut into it, ground becomes both strange and luring, something non-neutral, something reactive and fluid. A few years ago, students from the University of Edinburgh, when I was still teaching there, studied Les Calanques, which is a national park outside of Marseille in France. And it's a landscape that you're now looking at through this drone footage, a landscape composed of mainland, island, and marine areas that extend over an old, rugged, white, karst landscape. After roughly a 3-week mapping exercise in the studio to understand how this landscape currently exists through a diffuse progression from urban to suburban, peri-urban, and rural adjacencies, the students then realized how ground influences visitors as soon as they arrive on site. Routes that are apparently easily navigable when planned with the help of topo maps were quickly obfuscated by fractured rock outcrops. Hikes planned for the day soon became challenging rock climbing exercises that limited action on foot and exhausted the body. Photographic surveys using carefully selected viewpoints and drone footage were challenged by the park's geological complexity. The confrontation with the rugged ground that envelops, challenges, and affects our whole experience of the park forcefully impacted the students' design strategies. A site of intervention was simply not possible to demarcate in this case, for ground challenged any preconceptions that we had about stability, about slope, or land-water divides. Contour lines were abandoned very quickly in favor of ultra-specific spot heights that cling or nest precariously on rock that is at the same time solid and pulverized because of its karst nature. Landscape was something designed across scale from a working with the ground and not something that simply lied on it. And more recently, students enrolled in our sustainability design lab, in fact, our first edition, studied ground conditions in southern New England through a focus on clay. The group began, and Jan is here on one of these pictures, actually. The group began by learning some of the histories and stories of material and land use, tangled in power relations, value systems, and wider networks of material exchange, while also exploring clay's behavior in the landscape, as well as its unique property dynamics and how they have influenced its different uses in the built environment. This was a year-long experimentation, which is quite unusual for our studios here at RISD. So it's a whole academic year. And it was an invitation to move diligently between a close study and manipulation of the material, and then exploration through drawing and making with clay as a modular material and an in situ technique. What began as an exploration of sustainability through the manipulation of clay quickly became also a mode of design research where ground became very preponderant. Some students combined modular thinking with urban and ecological specificity so that the creation of new ground could regenerate and repair the landscape. Others challenged vernacular techniques such as cob or wattle and daub, like you're seeing on the images on the right, to increase ground's permeability or its carrying capacity. A third group devised instruments and devices where clay was conceptualized as matter that can be used to read, inform, and ultimately generate ground. The studio's premise to slowly zoom in from territorial analysis to prototype and then zoom back out to test the prototypes at the one-to-one scale encouraged the students to think about sustainability critically in spatial design as the delineation of limits of action and reaction determined on, by, and from the ground. So modularity can help problem solving when facing the need to scale up industrial processes, but it will struggle to be sustainable if not directly related to site or scale specificity. In situ vernacular techniques are potentially more sustainable by default, but only if they are in constant dialogue with what local ground asks for. Ground extraction and regeneration are a delicate balance where socio-environmental, economic, political, and cultural needs and demands need to coexist. Over the last couple of years, ecologist and artist, but also my friend and colleague Felipe Shibuya and I began a research initiative titled Rupture Regeneration, or in our native Portuguese language, because Felipe is Brazilian, Ruptura Regeneração, which looks at how socio-environmental desertification in Portugal's southern territories affects vernacular material and eco-agrarian cultures, from the micro scales of pigments and particles to the macro scales of ecosystems. The experimentation departed from a study of cork, which was our material, our focus, across scale to then explore its potential in innovative biomaterial approaches that can help communicate some of the conditions observed and tested in the landscape. The Portuguese geographical context in the western part of the Mediterranean basin and at the confluence of the Mediterranean Sea with the Atlantic Ocean has been the scene of accelerated processes of climate change, which in turn disrupt environmental systems and the equally complex phenomena of desertification, migration, and accentuation of inter and intra-community socioeconomic differences. So over the 20th and early 21st centuries, mainland Portugal has faced serious desertification, with strong pressure on coastal territories to where most of the population has now migrated. Inland regions like the one we were studying have suffered from abandonment, deterioration, and erosion in agricultural, industrial, and social activities. Focusing on methods that brought together fieldwork, different fieldwork activities and biomaterial experimentation with cork and vegetal and mineral pigments found in local montados. A montado is a cork farm like the one you're looking at. The study quickly unraveled into an exploration of cork in section. The cork oak tree, because the cork tree is a type of oak, requires a specific type of deep and poor soils where silt, sand, and clay fill the horizons. Moisture is trapped in the cork's crevices and channeled to the roots in areas that are otherwise very dry. The ecologies of the montados, especially when undisturbed for a relatively long period, so just for your reference, cork in this part of the world is harvested every 9 years. So the ecologies reveal a world of mycorrhizae, fungi, and lichen that is very distinct from other local environments. To understand how cork resists to fire, even if only to a certain extent, and helps fight against desertification, it is as important to study its territorial and topographical distribution as it is to scrutinize its longitudinal and transversal sections. So a longitudinal section in this case would be a section cutting across the tree into its leaves and roots, so vertically, and a transversal section would be cutting across or through the tree trunk to reveal its rings. So, walking the montado grounds, collecting pigments from local materials, grinding them to powder, and incorporating them in biomaterial recipes that we had to test to produce bioplastic, we became aware that color and structure percolate across scale, across different kingdoms, and different assemblages as well. The tree dissolves and absorbs earthy minerals from the soil, which are then incorporated in its plant tissues and slowly build up as cork being its outer bark layers. From a thinking on the ground, because we were literally walking on the ground, we were inevitably tangled in a thinking of the ground, for it gave us clues as to what to look for, what to harvest, what to process, what to incorporate. At some point in my life as a designer, this is the last project that I'm gonna show you. So at some point a few years ago, I was approached by the then director of MAU. MAU is the Museum of Architecture and Design of Slovenia. I was approached by that director with an interesting design commission where ground was brought to question different ideas of commonality and public space. Common Places, which is our intervention, was a constellation of micro interventions in Nove Fugine, which is this neighborhood that you're now looking at. Initially planned in the 1950s in the eastern reaches of Ljubljana, close to the Ljubljanica River. So it's a socialist type of urbanism. And today it is home to around 18,000 inhabitants. In this project, I collaborated with Plan Común, which is a fascinating French-Chilean practice, and also with the museum itself as a kickoff event for a design biennale that they were preparing for in 2016. So what perhaps you'll see a rather simple solution of changing public space was in fact the result of almost a year of hard work and a very long team of professionals that went way beyond us. But let me start from the beginning. So from a commission for an architectural intervention that would kick off this biennale, we immediately agreed collectively that we wanted a landscape-driven urban approach. Instead of producing a pavilion, which is a typology, in my opinion, overexploited by contemporary architecture, the project was conceived as a constellation of public space micro-interventions related to built and natural pre-existing conditions within the housing scheme. This organized system aimed at upgrading a series of common places identified on site by forging meaningful connections with their respective histories, spatial attributes and atmosphere, their cultural role within the structural public space, and also their social relevance within the community. By working closely together as a constellation, these interventions, these plinths, also make a gesture towards developing a distinct relationship between the museum's public grounds and its surroundings to strengthen the connection and encourage unexpected encounters between the residents and visitors to the museum. So upgrading here also becomes an experience, one of expanding the energy of and synergies between the neighborhood, MAU, the museum, and the Biennale, as well as catering to different types of both general and more specialized audiences. The interventions all followed one main typology. They are small plinths made of brick, all strategically placed throughout the neighborhood. In the museum courtyard, along the river, in the historic garden, the community center, or looking out into the surrounding fields. This family constructs, develops, or reinforces different uses of public space and specific relations with the surroundings. So some are platforms for contemplation, others are meeting points, stages for events, concerts or lectures, or simply structures on which to sit and enjoy the communal life of the neighborhood. The Slovenian media at that time covering the project described common places as plinths without a statue. To me, that was a very poetic way of saying that our statement, if any, is that public space, like these public spaces, are not for loud design commissions, but rather for quiet, not necessarily silent, but quiet subtleties ready for appropriation by an engaged community of all ages. In fact, and looking retrospectively, the plinths have dynamic statues. They celebrate the communities who use them, the landscape context where they exist. So, thinking back, this was almost 10 years ago, I believe there is a strong relationship with some of my core interests, namely with landscape architecture as some sort of curatorial practice. In this case, curation meant something rather different, a sort of curation of existing public space by means of introducing a system of architectural objects that become a measured ground for neighborly life. And they do so quietly, as I said, not silently, but quietly, meaning that they are there, they are witnesses to life. It is almost as if these plinths offer an element of apparent stability that never fully exists in a complete or solid way, but more in a sort of a way of potentiality. Now, if you remember, I began this presentation by advocating a thinking through ground as a fundamental component in landscape architecture, since it is a meaningful generator of landscape processes and forms. This type of thinking can be activated with the help of a section capable of organizing both thought and action in design and research practices, though sometimes it also transforms more conventional perceptions of ground as neutral, passive, or stable into something reactive, fluid, even strange. In landscape architecture, this conceptual section, which may or may not also become a representational device, tends to be a deeper section than perhaps, let's say, in architecture or engineering, and more akin to disciplines like geology, which are accustomed to both large leaps in spatial and temporal scales, as well as to measuring them at specific sets of scales. So a section of this nature, especially when exceptionally deep, carries two important characteristics: profound interconnectedness of its layers, which cannot be disentangled, and expansion of the cut itself, so that a large enough portion of the world is appropriately captured. Together, these two characteristics make the action of cutting through a particular reality, be it a city, a landscape, or any other spatial condition, profoundly ethical. And that brings me to, an ethics of matter. When discussing an ethics of matter, Karen Barad proposes the notion of a gential cut, which is less about separating a whole into parts, or let's say, one thing from another, and more about an ethics of cutting with responsibility and accountability for the lively relationalities of becoming, of which we are a part, to use one of her quotes. The idea here is that cutting through a particular condition implies what another thinker, Joanna Jelinska, calls an ethical injunction, which is made in the world and allows for more accountability. So if, as Joanna Jelinska writes, creative and critical thinking is perhaps the most political thing we can do, before we go do anything else, our endeavors in space and through time are always already ethical political. To that, we also need to add the fact that matters of concern are also concerns with matter. That is, our encounters in space are sensuous. Building community, trying to stage justice or access through resilience or a sense of belonging cannot or should not be dissociated from aesthetics. I side with theorists like Elizabeth Meyer, among many others, who are concerned with a perceived divorce between sustainability and the aesthetics, and who advocate for an insertion of aesthetics back into ethical concerns. Aesthetics should not be reduced to binaries of beauty versus function, but rather accepted as a type of emotional attachment that results from encounters with places, humans, non-humans, and things. So aesthetics is this affective force that generates emotional gratification and hopefully produces shared capacity and commonality. Coming to the end of this presentation, it is important, I would say, to bear in mind, however, that a thinking through ground, as in a cut through it, is always also already a thinking with ground, a gesture of what portion of the world is captured, why, and how. Once again, if we bring this idea closer to the realm of representation, thinking about ground is both thinking across and along it, a truly three-dimensional action from which we both reveal and refine what we value, how, and why. One last note then about potential values of ground. Essentially, what I'm arguing for here is for us to be more thoughtful about how we position ourselves in the world. What I'm arguing for here is perhaps a middle ground that transmits an idea of collectivity and allows that this idea begins to talk about commitment. Any eventual efforts to articulate these ideas introduced here today to you into what I now wish to call a pedagogy of ground can be very meaningful and, I would argue, needed in landscape architecture. But this requires nuance, and it's not without its potential pitfalls. Being diffuse and boundless, ground allows us to deal with the complexity of contemporary territories, for sure, but it also demands clear decisions of where to stop, when, how, and why. Being fluid and reactive, ground allows us perhaps to understand our condition better, but it also implies the recognition that design is a way of dealing with indeterminacy. Being unsettled and constantly reworked media ground may allow us to better read and interpret the signs and marks it contains, but it also encourages the acceptance that everything we do with it, everything, is consequential. In all these senses, learning about ground can also be regarded as a gesture towards the definition of landscape as forms and conditions of collectivity. Ground is where life on Earth is staged. It is where we exist and can begin to resist. It is where we can define what we want collectively, what we want to hold on to or let go. It is where conflicts can emerge, be generative or disruptive, and eventually be resolved. It is where landscape can be created, extracted, dilapidated, destroyed, but also reshaped, rebuilt, repaired. Finding ground, or grounding, is weirdly necessary if we wish to commit to a future that is increasingly uncertain and potentially also ever more turbulent, especially when the most violent disturbances and tensions worldwide, like war, mass destruction, or border controls, are motivated by land access, or more commonly, actually, the lack thereof. Understanding more about ground, it could be said, can also mean finding ways to coexist amidst contradiction and tension. In many ways, ground is strange. Or better put, once we seriously engage with ground, we might begin accepting the world as a stranger place. A world with no barriers, no delineations, no stability or neutrality or hideouts. A world where everything we design must be accounted for. So I leave you with this, in my opinion, wonderful thought by Karen Barad. Matter feels, converses, suffers, desires, yearns, and remembers. I make these words also mine when I think of ground. This is precisely the invitation to you as I stand here today. A stranger world is also a world full of wonder and possibility, a world whose ground matters precisely because it holds the potential for creativity and collective imaginaries. That's it. Thank you very much.
Questions, queries?
I'm going to stop sharing my screen, Sean, if that's okay, so that I can see you better, because otherwise everything is squeezed.
Surely someone's got something.
Does he have a favorite drawing or model? And
He can hear you from the roof.
oh,
Just speak up.
okay. Do you have a favorite drawing or model that you showed? Specifically, you have like a bunch in the beginning. And kind of what did you like learn from it, or what does that show?
You mean the models that I did as part of my work? Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can show them. I mean, I don't know, but I can share the screen again. Sorry for the confusion. I can show them perhaps again. So one of the, if I understood your question correctly, sorry, then let me just find the slide so that we don't jump. So for example, like when we look at this, just to explain you a little bit how I jump from drawing to model. This is a drawing that I did where you can see, you know, the skyline of New York, and how the skyline is actually explained. One way of explaining it would be to look for the rock line in moments where the rock is really close to the surface, is where the city could anchor the skyscrapers and therefore invest in building them. So that's why we see downtown with a lot of skyscrapers. Then when the rock dips in what we call the villages in between, the architecture becomes much lower. And then again in Midtown, where the rock comes to the surface, is where we have the skyline again. So this was a drawing that emerged very early in my process, and it allowed me to understand that the geology that supports New York, even though it is conceived of being very stable because it's very old, nice, and schist, it's actually pretty reactive. It's all fractured. There are a lot of passive fault lines that cross the island that explain, for example, how the water moves. And it's has nothing to do with how the orthogonal grid then was created on top of it. So when we then let me jump to a model like this. This is a model of one of these fault lines, more specifically, the fault line that exists under 125th Street, so in Harlem, the one that separates the main street that separates what we call Manhattanville to the south from Harlem to the north and east. And it's, if you guys know what I'm talking about, it's a moment in the orthogonal grid where we see kind of it seems like an accident to the grid. So when you start modeling the conditions of the ground under that road or that street, you start seeing that the reason why that street looks like an accident is because it corresponds to a very old valley that pre-exists the orthogonal grid. So I was following that logic for a while, and I started noticing that all of the infrastructure, everything from train tracks to elevated roads, to how they transport goods, how they transported water, everything was on stilts. It's actually a type of trellis that may resist seismic movements. And so I started conceiving of a model that could be seismic. So this is a model that existed on a plinth for a while. And every time people walked around it, the plinth was a little wobbly on purpose, and the whole model was shaking, to give the feeling, of course, of something shaking. And this was really interesting because then a few years later, I visited New York and I went to see this particular moment in the city. And that was last September, I think. And that's when actually there was an earthquake in New York. So this was kind of coincident or not. It was interesting. So then if we jump, just before I then shut up, when we jump into other types of work, what these logics allowed me to start visualizing are logics that are obfuscated by the grid, because the grid is so powerful that in cities like New York, we have forgotten how the landscape actually works. So all or most of the water on that island drains diagonally, meaning that has an orientation that cuts across the island from east to west. And it mostly drains from a ridge that exists in Manhattan that corresponds to Broadway. If you guys know what I'm talking about, Broadway is a ridge in New York, and the waters divide. Part of it drains to the East River, and the other part drains to the Hudson. And so landscapes like Central Park, which are essentially political, it was a political decision to make the rectangle like that. If we were to follow these other logics that are not rooted in capitalism or real estate, we would be able to start distorting this idea of the rectangle and the rigid limits. So all these pieces that you see here, the central rectangle is actually Central Park as it currently exists. And these other things, these other weird things that kind of break the rectangle are geologic formations and logics of drainage that could have been used to draw the park in a more in a way that followed the logic of water, soil, and ground more deeply. So this then became a model as well, done in this case with driftwood, clay and metal. So this was a moment, by the way, this is just a parenthesis. It was a moment when we were locked down during COVID. I'm sure that everybody here is old enough to remember that. So I could not, basically, I did not have access to any of the workshops or any of the equipment that we have here at RISD. So this was done in my room, one of my rooms here, and just with stuff that I had around me. So that's why the wood is all driftwood, because it was what I have access to. The clay that I had was a clay that could exist without having to be fired and things like that. But anyway, so this became a model that I then extruded all these pieces to, essentially start basically trying to visualize what this park could have become if it had followed these other logics. I don't know if I answered your question, but this is how my creative process goes. It's not very linear. It goes back and forth from drawing to model, and then I photograph the model like this. This is a photograph of that model seen from above that then I insert back into drawing to then start teasing out other conditions. So this drawing, for example, starts talking about Seneca Village, the first middle-class Black community in New York that had access to land, and so they could vote before this was, vilified as a slum and basically taken away from the community by eminent domain so that they could build a park. And that marks the beginning of not really a diaspora, but just a movement from the community, from Seneca Village to Harlem, and it coincides with the Harlem Renaissance period. So, there's a lot of stories here. I could talk for hours about this, but it goes to show how my creative process works.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
To speak.
Yeah.
Your work, from what I can tell, often looks at like more deep time, like geological timescales. How do you think those like longer timescales inform the like much shorter kind of human scale decisions we make as designers? And do you think we have a certain responsibility to we kind of have a certain responsibility when making those shorter timescales, knowing we're operating in a much longer kind of time frame?
Absolutely. That is an excellent question. That is one of the questions that I have, not just as a, as a practitioner, a designer, or a researcher, but also most of what I focus my energies on when I'm teaching. Because I do believe, like you said, I do believe that landscape architects, among others, but landscape architects definitely carry the responsibility to make others aware of what deep time does to the world. It's not an easy task, and some might even say that it's not really fair that we carry that weight, but I think we do, and it's because of a mixture of things. Some describe landscape architecture as this kind of meta-discipline, meaning that it's a discipline made of other disciplines, including things like geology, geomorphology, physics, chemistry, biology, ecology, etc. And because of that pool of knowledge that we draw from, we become aware of these other scales of time that are, for our human limited existence, very weird. It's something that starts describing geology, for example, essentially as plasticine, for example, if we were to simplify this, something that is malleable, something that is melted or molten, something that we can shape, right? But from our limited point of view as humans who are on this earth for 80, 90, 100 years, geology looks like stable, right? So how do we convey this through our projects? I think that there are, fortunately, many good examples of very skilled designers who can convey these preoccupations through their design. Not necessarily, I'm not advocating that we should always design with stone. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that we should design bearing in mind that these processes operate on completely, radically different timescales than the ones in which we exist. And so I believe that it is mostly through our aesthetic senses that we can convey these other time frames. Rather, we cannot show how a piece of rock evolves over the course of hundreds of millions of years or billions of years, but we can offer our visitors, offer people who come to our projects, a type of aesthetic experience that emanates those preoccupations, that foregrounds those preoccupations. And that is kind of what I try to do when I teach, is try to educate or, you know, work with my students to figure that out.
I'm going to claim the last question somewhat selfishly and somewhat pragmatically as well. So, Tiago, your drawings are remarkably generative within your own process, but also remarkably intricate, ornate, and time-consuming to produce.
Mm-hmm.
How do you work with your students around getting them to work with representation in a generative way when sometimes perhaps the demands of studio demand like an instantaneous, perhaps pragmatic action?
You sound like a student of mine asking that question. Okay, so how do I answer that question? Yes, so first part, I think you're reading this correctly. My work takes a long time to produce. I have the luxury, I feel it is a luxury, of being a scholar who's, you know, my salary is paid because I'm a teacher, and then all of this is something that I can do on the side. When I design, let's call like real projects that are to be implemented and constructed, I cannot afford to do this type of work. So that's the first thing. When I teach my students, I'm not necessarily invested in them getting to this level of production, because what we do here is to educate people to become designers, you know? So it's a slightly different thing. The students here at RISD are eager to learn this type of representational methods, but it's always in service of something else. That allows them to build things in the real world, engage with communities, do outreach and dissemination, work with public and private sectors, and so on and so forth, like I believe your students in Virginia also do. So to answer your question more specifically and as honestly as I can, our students spend a lot of time in the studio, a lot of time. So the studio is the central spine here at RISD, is what carries more credits towards their graduation. And it's kind of, we carve their schedule in a way that allows them to spend a substantial amount of time in the studio. And we instructors are also a lot of the time in the studio with them, designing side by side. This is not a type of education where we come, we deploy an assignment, we launch it, and then we leave, right? It's a type of activity where I spend sometimes, I'm not going to lie, 12 hours in the studio with them, especially when we come to the end of the semester like we are now. I was telling Sean just before you guys came into the room that it's one of these times where in the semester where everybody starts to kind of freak out a little bit. And so like yesterday I spent 12 hours in the studio with my students. Whether or not that's healthy, that is debatable, but that's how we get the students to then, you know, iterate, produce, not be afraid of that production, and then have time to critically reflect back as a way to move forward.
Cool. Thank you, Tiago. Let's give last round of applause.
Thank you so much, guys. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure. As I said, and I told Sean this before, I would love to have the opportunity to visit you soon. Or if you guys are up here in New England, in Providence or Boston or New York, and you want to just visit us, you're always very welcome.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And I'll drop you an email over the weekend.
Thank you. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.